Welcome to the COSME Astrology Podcast. Thank you all for being here. This is a very special moment for us, and we are so glad and honored and privileged to have Rick Levine here with us. So thanks, Rick, for being here.
Back at you. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely.
It's funny. I see you through this little
Yeah,
we can move
window.
that.
Is that going to be okay, or should we switch it up?
No.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. So if you're new here, COSME is a community astrology and wellness studio. I thought of this idea and it just hit me when I was at the OPA conference in 2022. I did not know that there was actually a group of astrologers here in Tucson until I went to that conference. And when I was there, I was able to speak the language of astrology with more than 100 astrologers, and it felt really good. It felt freeing. It was inspiring. And actually, Rick was one of the first people I met at that conference, and he asked if I had heard of TAG. Hadn't heard of TAG. So then I Googled it, and anyway, now I'm involved with Tucson Astrologers Guild. But yeah, I just think there's a lot of power and a lot of empowerment and a lot of really potent conversations that come through when we're all in person and we're one-to-one and we are experiencing each other's energy and we're able to talk about the cosmos. It's truly beautiful. You know, I'm sure all of you have had moments as astrologers where you're out and about and you have like something to say about astrology and maybe there's no one there to actually listen, or maybe it may sound like, you know, off the wall to some people. So I think having a space that is a little more accessible is really important. So, you know, that's why this place exists. So thank you for being a part of it. We love seeing you guys here and we love having you here. So without further ado, we shall get started. But Taylor.
I'm Taylor Shuler.
Yeah, sorry,
Hi.
I didn't introduce Taylor. So Taylor, do you want to let everyone know who you are and what you do?
I'm Taylor Shuler, and I'm an astrologer, and I have a background in HR, so I come from this like kind of labor perspective and help people find clarity on what their purpose is in life and how to do that through the work that they do all the time. And I'm super grateful that Rick is here as well, and Lisa, because that's where I met both of them for the first time also. I mean, I've seen you, but
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, you know, I think we've all watched Rick, but that's actually where I met Rick, and it was really exciting. So yeah, but you know, if you don't know who Rick is, I feel like you have such a magnificent bio, but the one thing I want to say about Rick is the energy that he brings to astrology, the enthusiasm he brings to astrology, and the wisdom that he brings to the astrological community is truly like the best part of what Rick does and best part of his bio. So thanks for that. And
William Blake wrote, "If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise." I've just stood in the same place for 50 years.
It's beautiful.
well, it's better than like, what is it? Wisdom was chasing you, but you were faster. So
Yeah,
better to be that.
I've been there. I've been there too.
Yeah.
Definitely. All right, well, let's get started. So we're going to talk about the history of the astrological community, and this is through Rick's lens and through Rick's eyes. So Rick, we have some questions for you, and we'll just keep the conversation pretty conversational. And
we want to mention there's going to be a break in 60 minutes.
yeah, we did mention that to everyone,
Okay.
but just so you know too, there's going to be a break in about 60 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll have another hour.
Then the
after.
break gets repaired.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. So, Rick, when and where did you get started as an astrologer?
My dad went on a business trip to the Mediterranean, and I studied with Pythagoras. No, it sometimes feels that way. And I've always been interested in things on the edge. You know, when I have Uranus in the first house. Uranus is my rising planet in Gemini. And when I was told I shouldn't do something, being, you know, an Aries, a lot of planets in Aries, if someone said, don't read that, I read it. You know, if someone said, don't do that, I did it. If I was doing something I really liked and someone said, you know, this is the book we now have to read, I'd put it down. It was like, you know, I've hopefully outgrown some of that. But astrology really came in my life somewhere in like, I don't know, junior high school-ish, when I was reading a lot of science fiction and books on UFOs and psychic this and hypnotism and numerology and astrology, and it was just one of the things, you know. And then when I went to college to be a math major, actually to be a geometry teacher. And weirdly enough, here I am 50 years later, I'm a fucking geometry teacher. You know,
Definitely.
But the weird thing is, well, not the weird thing is, I got to college and within a few weeks I changed my major from math and wanted to be a math teacher to psychology. And I just assumed because I was good academically, I just assumed that I would go to the Jungian Institute. I was totally, you know, enamored with Freud and Jung and Erich Fromm and Wilhelm Reich and all of the, you know, Freudian school that gravitated in many, many different ways. And in my senior year, I'd already decided I had enough of academia. I did not want to go to graduate school, which I just assumed I would. And in my senior year, I'd kind of waded my way through a lot of the Bollingen series, you know, Jung's writings, and was particularly intrigued by alchemical studies and symbols of transfiguration. And around that time, someone gave me a book, and the book changed my life. And the book was a book by Dane Rudhyar called The Astrology of Personality. And are you looking there? You have,
I think this is person-centered astrology.
Yeah.
Well, that's a different book, but but it was basically the subtitle, and I don't remember word for word, was something like a reevaluation of astrology based upon 20th century philosophy and psychology. How close did I get?
I don't know what page it's on, but
The Astrology of Personality, and the subtitle is a reformulation of astrological concepts and ideals in terms of contemporary psychology and philosophy. I was close. And it was basically the astrological origins of Jungian psychology. And at that time, I'd read books, and, you know, Linda Goodman's Sun Signs was like popular then, and What's Your Sign and Hair was off Broadway, not on Broadway yet. And I was at college just outside of New York at Stony Brook University, and astrology was cool. And I was already looking up people's Mercury and Venus and whatever, not really calculating charts by hand. But I read that book by Dane Rudhyar, and I went, holy shit, you mean this isn't just a cool parlor game that works? I mean, there was something that was like, I didn't doubt that it worked. I'd seen it, but I had no idea it was the underpinning to pretty much everything in Western civilization. And so, you know, I read that book and I decided I would be an astrologer. I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't know any astrologers, but when I graduated, I was lucky enough to get involved at a bookstore. I moved to Minneapolis. You don't need to hear the gory details there, out of New York. But the person who ran the bookstore's husband, not the bookstore's husband, but the person who ran the person's husband, that's it. The person's husband who ran the book, well, he didn't run the bookstore. Okay, I don't know. We need a grammarian here. Dangling participles. That's like I threw my grandmother from the train a kiss.
The husband of the person who ran the bookstore?
What's that?
The husband of. Might be passive.
Oh, I'm in Aries. I hate passive. All right. All right. Anyhow, her husband was a computer engineer or something, and she was an astrologer that had this like bookstore, new and used books, and there were no classes there. It was just a large conference room-sized table with a pot of coffee that was on from about noon until about 10 p.m. And there were always 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 astrologers sitting around the table with charts, and that's where I kind of that was boot camp for me. And she was, at that time, running all the charts for Llewellyn, because that was in Minneapolis, Llewellyn and St. Paul right across the river. And in fact, she was running all of Noel Till's charts. He was living in St. Paul at that time. And so, long story short, I still didn't know that there was an astrology world out there. I just knew the books and was a natural of some sort. You hear this from a lot of astrologers. I think Susie and I talked about this. Many of us never learned astrology. We just kind of remembered it. And I'm sure that that's a common thing when we have it in our blood or psyche or past lives or future lives or something. And my first astrology conference that I went to was a conference that was the only astrology conference ever put on by Llewellyn. And it was called Gnosticon, and it was in Minneapolis, not far from where I lived. And so I went. It was like a Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, and at that conference I heard people like, Isabel Hickey and Marcia Moore and Noel Till and mathematical geeks like Charles Jane and Charles Emerson, and and it was like, like many people, many of you, first astrology conference, it's like, it's a language, and I hear people, like you said, Lisa, Taylor, it's like, I hear people talking it. And so that really confirmed what I was doing, but I still had no idea really what an astrologer really did, other than, I knew they did charts, and of course, then it was very different than now. Every chart that you did was a pencil and a paper, and and either logarithms, tables of houses, interpolation, making out aspect tables, counting, degrees on your fingers or whatever. And it was around that time that the Digicomp, the first astrology computer, little like a calculator that calculated charts, came in. And so that was like 75-ish, 76. By 77, I bought my first computer. And so really, and now this is less about me than it is about the reflection of the arc of the astrology world, because most people who were doing charts back in the early 70s, there was no choice. I mean, you could use a calculator, but you had to do them by hand, and then there were a couple of chart calculation services around that sprung up, but they were all on mini computers like Neil Mickelson, which became ACS, and a book publisher too. But if you were an astrologer, you basically had to be a mathematician. Period. And so I began doing charts, and it was around 1977-ish when I began doing a chart for someone else. And I think I charged $30, for my first charts that I did. But then I began realizing this is what I want to do, and I've juggled a couple of careers, in order to get along in the way, because at that point in time, basically being an astrologer was taking out an ad in the Yellow Pages and waiting for someone to call you. Very, very different than the community that has sprung up now. So I think that from my point of view, without again focusing on what I did year by year or decade by decade, I think the extraordinary thing about the astrology community is that it began to coalesce on a different level than it had before. And it wasn't just computers, because there was an organization, the AFA, and then when the astrologers began to feel like the AFA wasn't watching out for them, because it was kind of an organization that looked like an organization of astrologers, but it was really a business. And so astrologers began to kind of gather together, and then I'm guessing it was probably in 78 or 80. You were probably there, Susie, when AFAN was founded in Chicago. I think that was 84. And so, it kind of like all at once, there was a coming together of three different organizations that really became the organizations that all came together for the same reason, but with different roles and intentions. And AFAN, which was really originally AFA, but it was AFAN. It was the Association of Federated Astrologers network, but it became its own organization because it was not welcome for, by AFA at that time. And then NCGR, which kind of took a more of an educational path, and like some other people and or organizations did their best to do astrology but call it something else. So there's no astrology word in NCGR. It's the National Council for Geocosmic Research, which is just a fancy way of saying astrologers and not offending people who might be offended by that word. And then there was ESAR, or the International Society for Astrological Research. And that kind of was, that was still all way pre, there were computers floating around then, but if you had a computer, it was like you had a book, but it was electronic or digital or whatever. There was no connection to anything else. And I'm guessing it was probably more like 80, well, even in 84, 85, there were modems and bulletin boards. Yeah, please.
Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Astrolabe did Nova in 1980.
In 1980, yes, and
Got Matrix, and it was just on those little apples at the time, but that was their first, and then they evolved into Solar Fire later.
well, yeah, actually, they didn't really evolve into Solar Fire. They became the North American distributor for Solar Fire. That was an Australian program. But at the same time, that's like 1980, actually even going back a little bit before that, in 76, 77, which was when I first met Michael Erlewine, I was there when he unpacked one of his first Commodore PETs, which was like a, pre-anything computer. And I was already had the computer bug. I'd bought a TRS-80, which was an original Radio Shack computer, and then a Commodore PET, and then it became very quickly an addiction. But yeah, Michael Erlewine also, the first Blue Star came out. I'm thinking it was a little program that you could only run using a cassette tape attached to your computer, that you'd have to turn the computer on, plug in the cassette tape, and the program was on the cassette tape, and it just went and then you had the program loaded, and that was in like 1978, 79. But Nova and Matrix really kind of came into being around the same time, but even still then, there were modems and bulletin boards, but there was no concept of using your computer to talk to another computer. It just, and even being on a modem, you had to, plug your computer into this device, into your phone, put the phone in it, and then wait for a dial tone, and then you'd hit the right button, and it'll go, then your phone would connect, and then you could be on a bulletin board where you could download stuff, but there was no astrology on it. And I don't remember the year, but somewhere in that time, still in modem days, pre-internet days, there were what were called email lists, or IRC or MIRC for those of you who are geeky. And there was a group out of Edinburgh. Were you on that list, Susie? The original, what was it called? It was basically the way it worked was this. It was, you signed up to be on an email list, and then you had an email address that you sent an email to. Now, this had to have been already in the 90s, because I think I got my first email address, I think it was 89 or 90, and I got it, but I couldn't figure out what email was. No, really. It was like, it didn't make any sense to me, and I didn't know quite how to get an email address, and a lot of people first kind of got online through AOL, which was kind of like, not real internet, but it was like a private network on internet. But the email list that I got on was really the first digital community that I was involved in, and many other astrologers around at that time. And basically what you would do is you would send an email to this email address at the University of Edinburgh. That's who hosted, on their computer, they hosted this email list. You'd send an email to that email address, and its program would immediately send it out to everyone who was on the list. So when you logged on through your modem and got online, the first thing that would happen, you would get 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 emails from different people who had sent emails to the list that had gone out to everyone. And then you'd read through them, and the ones that you wanted to respond to, you would respond, and they would go out to everyone. And that was really kind of the first astrological networking online of that sort. But I should say that even prior to that, there was Mercury Hour, a woman named Edith Custer. The Mercury Hour? Yeah, I think that was it. Mercury Hour. No, okay. Well, that no. Then prior to that, it was not the Mercury Messenger, Mercury something. And she basically you paid her $20 a year, and she had a little business that she once a month would ditto or mimeograph or print up this little thing that was stapled in the upper left-hand corner. It was usually 5 to 15 pages. And like the email list, there would be conversations. And if you read something, that you would basically write a letter and you'd send it to Edith Custer, and then she would put it in the next month's Mercury. No, it was the Mercury Hour. The thing on UAC was something, it was Mercury something else, because I did that one year. And that was at Monterey. I did the daily newspaper at UAC. And Marion March would come by every night because at UAC, let me back up and talk about UAC. And I wasn't at the first 2 UACs, but I don't know why I'm sitting here, and I like being here. Thank you very much. But Susie could be here also, because she's basically been involved in the community as long, and maybe on the national community even longer than I have. But the first United Astrology Congress was in San Diego in 1986, and then the second one was in New Orleans 3 years later in 89, and then the following one was my first one, and I think that was Washington, D.C., 92 in Washington, D.C. Was that it? I think so. Yeah, no, it was 92, and then 95 was Monterey, California, and then it was Orlando, and then it was Atlanta. Yeah, and then
we want to give you a microphone.
Yeah, we're going to give you a mic.
Yeah.
No, you're okay.
No, we want you to.
Oh, thank you. These are the UAC conferences. 1986 was San Diego, and I think it was the best one.
everyone who was there and is still alive says the same thing.
Yeah, and I did a evening entertainment, and so did Michael Luton. You know, it was a talent show, and Noel Till was God.
Well, just for the record, he still is. He's just not on this earth plane.
So San Diego, 86, 89, New Orleans, 92, Washington, D.C., and that was the Alien Follies.
And I was in that. That's where we met.
It was a big show.
It was a huge show.
One of the biggest, I think we've done.
Yeah.
95 was Monterey.
Yeah, and that's where I did the Mercury Hour. What? It was the Mercury Hour. The Edith's was something else. It was the Mercury, not Mercury Messenger.
So 95 was Monterey. 98 was Atlanta.
Yeah.
2002
was Orlando.
That's the one that Aaron got in trouble, if anybody knows that.
Yes, and that was also Howard Sesportus's last.
No, his.
Oh, is that when that was
in
it?
Monterey?
In Monterey.
What is the story?
It's a long, juicy story.
Okay.
I'm gonna.
Okay.
There's lots of long, juicy stories in the Naked City.
2008 was Denver.
Yep.
And 2012, New Orleans again.
Yep.
And then 2018 was Chicago, and that was the last one.
Right.
So that's really interesting because, Susie, you and I have talked about the 1986 UAC, and I've asked you a lot of questions about it, but Chris Brennan released that on the Astrology Podcast. Yes.
It's on YouTube also. You don't even have, you can get it through Chris, but it's been, that documentary has been kicking around for years. Yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
When I watched it, well, first off, let me just say Cancer Moon. But I definitely cried like the first 3 times because it's very moving. I was 6 years old at the time, but to watch the community come together in that way, and for people who are newer astrologers, or, you know, in this generation of astrology, let me just say, to see, like, you know, I watched the Astro Drama with Michael Luton, and, you know, it was moving. And to hear Robert Hand up there speaking, it's just magnificent. So, Rick, during that time, were you speaking at the conferences, or were you attending?
No, no.
Okay.
No, I was not. I had been doing astrology, and again, I don't want to focus on me too much.
Right.
But in 1981, I was living in Minneapolis, and my then wife and I quit our day jobs. I was actually doing consulting. I closed my consulting office. We sold 2 cars. We sold the home we owned, and we bought a Dodge van and took our 4-year-old kid and declared ourselves born-again hippies. And so we lived the next year in a van, and then we settled in Southern California. And I just got swept up into a corporate Southern California thing that involved computers and software and whatever. But I still was doing and interested in astrology. And during that period of time, I met Carol Ryder, an old, well, he was old, but one of the astrologers from the golden age of Hollywood, where, you know, Carol Ryder, Sidney Omar, probably a few other people, Carol Ryder would have these monthly gatherings at his mansion in the Hollywood Hills, and with a swimming pool in the back with all these Greek statues and everything. And about 50 astrologers and students would come every month, and we'd have a little presentation and then settle into work groups. And then Carol would come down. He was in a wheelchair at that time, and he would give a reading for the month. And so I was doing astrology. But then astrology ended up being put in boxes and in a garage, because I had a house and a kid and a job downtown, and, you know, and commitments. And it was at that time in my life I had the transit that earlier in my life I was looking forward to, because I have 4 planets mid-Aries trine Pluto mid-Leo, and their midpoint is my Gemini ascendant, which means that the point that makes a grand trine is my descendant. 4 planets in the 11th house in Aries, Pluto in the 3rd house in Leo, Sagittarius is descendant. And I was always looking forward to when Uranus hit the descendant. I thought that would be cool, because it would make a grand trine. And at that time, my one saving grace was, although I was working, like I said, downtown doing computer, you know, distribution and computer just stuff. Every morning, I lived just a few minutes from the beach. I would get up, I would go down to the beach, I would roller skate between Venice and Santa Monica piers, and then go jump in the ocean, then have coffee, then come home, take a shower, and go to work. Well, one of those days, I was out standing on the end of Venice Pier. It was a gorgeous morning. I took a deep breath, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground. I fell. And my hand hurt like hell, and I went into the emergency room, no broken bones. They gave me a tetanus shot, and 5 days later, I had the proverbial red line all the way up my arm, and I spent 10 days in the hospital. And this knuckle is, like, you see when I open my hand or close it, that knuckle is that's where I fell. But that is during the next few months, I couldn't go to work, I couldn't drive a car, I couldn't zip up my pants, I couldn't shave, I couldn't brush my teeth. I'm a right-handed person, and I had no use of my right hand. And so my astrology books and my music and my poetry kind of came out of the garage, and I never really went back to work. And this is like my reminder, my physical body reminder that, you know, you fucked up, and, you know, you kind of lost it, and we're taking over, and this is what you got to do, not that.
That's a pretty Uranus and Gemini on the ascendant type of Uranus opposition to happen.
Yeah.
Since Gemini is like the arms and the hand. And
Yeah. But it was during that time that that UAC happened, and all my stuff was coming back out of the boxes. It was after my hand accident. And I was living in LA, and I knew it was right down the block and around the corner, so to speak. And I thought about going, but I had commitments home, and it just passed. It just passed me by. So no, I did not go. I had never spoken at a conference. Even back in Minneapolis days in the late 70s, I started, though, a little organization there called CARE, C-A-R-E, and it was the Center for Astrological Research and Education. And when I left Minneapolis in '81, someone else took over that office in that group, and it became the NCGR chapter, which is still functioning in Minneapolis. But I was not doing any national, anything of any sort, and it really wasn't until until late '80s, early '90s, really is when I began doing any kind of connection on and then in the early '90s, I was on AFAN. Their government was they're no longer. They've been folded into OPA now, but it was a steering committee rather than a board of directors, and everything was done by consensus. Majority did not rule. You talked it out until everyone agreed, and thanks to Jim Lewis, who just wouldn't let anything go if it wasn't right, and But I was on the AFAN steering committee through the early '90s. And I'd moved up to Seattle from LA, and that's really where I started plugging into the Seattle organization, and then AFAN, and then that's kind of where I launched into that realm. But I'd been doing astrology for a long time already. Not an uncommon story. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of amazing, incredible astrologers out there that are just not connected with this community. And it's easy to say, well, they're not an astrologer if they're, but they are. And even more so now with the internet. There's just so many brilliant astrologers who began getting the information offline and have been studying it for, since they were like 6 or 7 years old, because it's there. And we didn't have that. So, I don't know about you, Susie, but for me, I remember getting interested in astrology, and you go to the bookstore. Well, there was no online to go to. You go to the bookstore, and there were like 6 books. That was it. Everyone had, a Grant Louis book and a, Sidney Omar's My Life in Astrology and Alan Leo's A to Z Delineator. And, if you're really geeky, you had a book by Carl Payton, Toby, thank you, who's a local, I understand. And, but now you go online and there's probably 3,000 or 4,000 astrology books, and granted, some of them are crap, but a lot of them are not. And so it's a huge difference in coming up and being an astrologer now. I'm interested in in nodes. Well, here's 6 books, pick one. I'm interested in this here, whatever it is, and it's a very, very different world of coming up in astrology today than it was for us, because there were no books, or there were a handful of books, and there was no computer calculations. It was by hand or sending out and waiting 2 weeks or a week to get the chart back from some computer service, and then, the Neptune, the Neptune-Pluto conjunction, and all of a sudden, everything's self-wired.
So I know we have a list of questions, but I have one.
Okay, I'm done. That was whatever your opening question was. That was my opening answer.
It was, how did you get started, just for the record? But that was fabulous, because you answered several of the other questions that Lisa had lined up for you.
Totally.
But I think a lot of what I heard was like location, bookstores, putting an ad out in the paper, and my Sag stellium is just like trying to bridge the gap between generations in terms of understanding. And you've pointed this out, the technological differences between now and then. And so, what was it like, and how did, you went to a bookstore, but when you got to LA or you got to Seattle, how did you find people, and how did you do that in a place and time where I don't know what it was like, because I wasn't alive, but
have you ever heard of Yellow Pages?
Yeah, so was that it? You just put something in the Yellow Pages?
Or
and
you
then
went to the Yellow Pages and you looked up astrologers, and there were 2 or 3 numbers, and you called them.
And you just said, "Hi, I'm Rick.
I'm new to the area," and sometimes there were people or there were events. I was lucky enough even in LA, I lived in Los Angeles for 7, 8 years, moved up to Seattle. And it was only when I moved up to Seattle, I was doing consulting work back in LA. So I was in LA for a week, a month for the first 3 or 4 years I lived in Seattle. And it was only then I stumbled upon Aquarius workshops and became really good friends with Angel Thompson. And on my monthly visit down to LA, I would stay at Angel's house. But I had I didn't even know when I was living there that Zip Dobbins was there, or Marion March, or Aquarius workshops that was going on without me. There's a wonderful book, Herman Hesse, Journey to the East. Anyone read it? I mean, for me, the stunning thing about that book, the short version of the story is that there's a guy who's in this group of people, and they're doing this incredible, explorations, journeying, whatever, and they meet once a month or something like that. And then his life goes on, the group disbands, and his life goes on. And 30 years later, something happens, and he runs into one of the people that was in the group, and only to discover that the group never disbanded. And in other words, there was no way that group was going on, but we detach and we think there's nothing there. Now with the internet, all you got to do is go online and hit a few keywords, and everything that's there that connects out in the environment, and whether it's local or not, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But the other thing is, like, in the early 70s, in the early mid 70s, I totally geeked out on harmonics. I read John Addy, and I had, matter of fact, it was in 1975 when I went to Gnosticon, and I met Charles Emerson, who was doing cosmobiology and using a 90-degree wheel, and I was like, whoa, this stuff's amazing. And then I read John Addy, and I realized it's not just a 90-degree wheel. You can make a fifth harmonic, a 72-degree wheel. You can make a 125th harmonic, a 2.5-degree wheel. What the hell is this stuff? And being a little bit of a math geek, out came the calculator, and for months I was calculating harmonic charts by hand. Now you put in someone's birth data, you hit a button, and you have 3,000 harmonic charts. You don't have to do the math, It's like in the early days, if you had a car, you had to know how to work the motor and change the oil and do the timing belt and whatever. And now you open up a car, and it's just like looking at the inside of a computer. What the fuck is that? I have no idea. Mm-hmm. I don't even know what there's like 7 belts in them, and I have no idea. There's no pants to hold up. What the hell are they doing? I don't know.
So we've definitely gone through, obviously, this period of evolution, and it's so different for astrologers now, because a lot of us have learned on test that was a certification test. And when I became president, already being the computer geek that I was, the test was a one-day test. It was an 8-hour test. The morning was calculations. You had to do a chart by hand, and you had to do it for a western and eastern longitude, a northern and southern latitude, and it was basically chart calculation. The afternoon part of the test was interpretation. And I became president, and I said, this is really stupid, because why do we have equal amounts of calculation? We have computers. Why, And Joanne Wickenburg, some of you may know Joanne's work. She was a Seattleite before she moved to Wickenburg, Arizona. And Joanne had been a previous president of this organization, and Joanne and I sometimes went eye to eye, or whatever. And on this one, she was basically very strong, as were several other of the
what I would consider older generation astrologers, including Laura Nalbandian's mom, Maggie, who ran the astrology bookstore and was the founder of Norwalk and kind of the matriarch of astrology in the Northwest. And I got a lot of resistance. It was like, no, we have to still do that. People have to know. And then this was a discussion that went over months and over even a year, and somehow in the process the test stopped being given, period. But I was told that no, people need to know, because even if you use a computer, you still need to know. And I said, well, I'm not against that, but what do they get to bring in to to do the chart? Do you get to use a calculator? Well, sure, they can bring in a calculator. Well, how about a programmable calculator? Well, no, that's probably not. Well, maybe. There were no such thing as desktops then in 1992-ish. They were still a few years. Well, they were, but they were very very, very rustic. And I said, okay, I get it. I think that it's really important to not lose how to calculate a chart, that one needs to have some sense. But I think that we shouldn't allow people to bring in ephemeruses. I mean, because there was a time when, in order to do a chart, you had to go out under the night sky and look and take your measurements with your astrolabe and come back in and solve spherical triangles with logarithms and sines and cosines and all that stuff. And I said, so I'm down with it, but no tables of houses, no ephemeruses. And I think people should know how to calculate a chart just to be, but no one does it. I mean, you get to a point where why would you need to know how to make a tire if you're going to put one on your car?
That makes sense.
It's a very sixth house Virgo question. It's like, it's about, I mean, and you already answered it without blatantly saying it, but it's about passing on the wisdom and the knowledge to future generations so that it's not lost in case of technological meltdown or the burning of the library at Alexandria or something like that, where we just don't have
Or the burning of the library in Florida.
Whatever, all of it.
Or libraries,
So you mentioned the Neptune-Pluto conjunction a few times, and one of the things that we wanted to talk about was, like, what were some of those major configurations and their impact on the astrological community, and what can we learn from those, like, big turning points that stand out to you in your experience, or any of you in your experience, and like going forward with some of the big transits that we have?
Well, in the 20th century, or at least in my life, I mean, the biggest ones were the slowest moving, planets, as they certainly the 1960s. If you use Tarnassian aspects, we know what Tarnassian aspects are. Rick Tarnas, I always call people who are students of Rick Tarnassians because it kind of sounds Star Trek-y. But basically, you're talking about a Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and you would basically go 1960 to 1972. So you're looking at very wide, not natal horoscope, aspects or orbs rather. And I think that one was huge. Let's not forget that Linda Goodman became the first author, not astrology author, but the first author to be given a six-figure advance on a book. And the book, Sun Signs or Sun Sign Astrology, Sun Signs. I think that was the name of the book.
Sun signs. Sun signs.
Sun Signs.
Yeah.
Sun signs.
Huh? Love Signs, and then there was Goobers, and there was, my favorite of her books is Venus Trines at Midnight. She was an Aries, and even though she kind of focused on that sun sign, that simple astrology, she was an absolute witch of magical proportions. The stuff that she wrote was amazing. Here's a crazy story. So I was at her funeral. There were only 2 astrologers at her funeral from outside. It was in Cripple Creek, up in the hills in outside of Colorado Springs, where she was living, and it turned out at that time I was dating, hanging out. I don't know what the word is, with an astrologer who was living in Denver, and she and I was in Washington D.C. on some sort of business, something. I was doing work in the natural food industry, organizational work at that time, and this had to have been around 95-ish, and I get a phone call from this person, Sandra Licerio, and she's a brilliant astrologer, good astrologer, and still practices out of Boulder. And I was planning on going to Boulder and hanging out with her for the weekend, and I get a phone call that said, and she said, did you hear Linda Goodman died? And I said, yeah, I just saw it on the news or whatever. And she said, well, I have a friend named Philip DeFranco who was Linda Goodman's publicist in the 70s. And he's been invited to give the eulogy at her funeral. He lives in L.A., and he's coming out and staying in Denver. He doesn't have a way to get down to the conference. Are we doing anything on Saturday? And if not, do you want to go to Linda Goodman's funeral? So there I was with Sandra Lee and a lot of family, and it was very, very strange. But it was kind of like a passing of the torch. And as long as we get on Linda Goodman, Nick Campion, who, World Horoscopes and the master's program at the university in Lampeter in Wales, Nick Campion, after the UAC in Denver in 2004, it doesn't matter. You don't need to look it up. It doesn't matter. That after that UAC, he was there with his wife, and they went up and they just spent a couple days touring the area, and they ended up going up to the mountains and stayed at this little B&B in Cripple Creek. And they opened up a drawer in one of these desks, and there was a piece of paper in the back, and it was a handwritten note from Linda Goodman just was when she was staying at this B&B like 20 years prior.
Wow.
Crazy story.
That's amazing.
2008.
2008.
And Taylor, what was the question?
We were
I
asked.
don't remember anymore.
Oh, the major
turning,
aspects.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened in the 60s was really important, because even though they weren't technical astrology as we know it, there were people doing technical astrology. People, like Charles Emerson, Charles Jane, Michael Erlewine, people doing work like, the beginnings of what, even here, I mean, the astrologers like Sidney Omar and Carl Payne Toby, and I mean, there was astrology was buzzing, AFA was buzzing. I mean, it was happening, and the musical Hair and the popularity of the song by the Fifth Dimension, This is the Dawning of the Age of Aquarius, which we know that the moon is in the 7th house every day, and Jupiter aligns with Mars. It depends if you're using Ptolemaic aspects or whatever.
But wasn't that surprising because someone was naked at the end of Hair or something like that?
Oh, no,
That
it was the whole
shocking.
cast was naked.
Oh, okay.
And it was like shocking for
Yeah.
people. I saw Hair on Broadway,
Yeah.
and when I saw it on Broadway, that had to have been like 1968. But it was already over the hill. Whatever that was, that happened in 64, 65, 66, the Summer of Love and the free speech movement in Berkeley. But all of that stuff was feeding what became the 60s, and astrology was part of it. Prior to that, no one ever said, "What's your sign?"
Okay, so here's a question about the transits, because I've been thinking about the 60s a lot, and the Pluto opposition that comes from like the 40s and 50s and how it's, in Aquarius now. So we have the Pluto and Leo generation that was really the part of the 60s and that hippie movement and things moving forward. Pluto then moves into Virgo during that time, right? When the Pluto and Leo generation is progressing. Now we've got Pluto, the opposite sign of Aquarius. And what I personally am noticing, and I don't know if you agree or disagree, whatever.
I agree.
Thank you. Right answer, correct.
I have Gemini rising. I'll agree. I'll agree with anyone.
It's that I have this sense that there's Leo, I'm a Pluto and Scorpio, and we've got Pluto and Aquarius, and the hippies are not hippieing anymore.
What does that mean?
Like, okay, so the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction with the students protesting on campus, for example.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the initial reaction that I got from, and sorry, Pluto and Leos, if you
You're
feel
not going to
differently,
offend this
but
one.
it's, you know, the initial reaction that I got from many Pluto and Leos was, these kids need to stop doing this on the campuses. And I was like, y'all started this. Like,
Yeah.
what are you
Two
talking
things.
about?
Number one, there's not a lot of Pluto and Leos that I know that are saying that, and if they are, I'm smacking them down.
Okay.
Just to be really clear. But I think there's something here about the process of aging and settling in,
Yeah.
and Saturnian energy, how it crystallizes and we become. You know, there's this whole thing of. I mean, in the late '60s, I was pretty damn sure that it was all going down by 69, 70, 71. The American system as we knew it wouldn't last until 72 or 73. I mean, that was the feeling. But I was in a bit of a radical hotbed in college. In my 4 years as an undergraduate, school was not in session one semester at finals for 4 years. So I lived in that universe. I didn't go to Chicago in 1968, but 3 of my housemates that I lived with that summer were there on the streets. And yeah, I mean, what we're seeing right now, I think is setting us up for what I think will be, and some of you have listened, I've said this online a number of times, but I think that, let me back up. Mid-60s, Uranus-Pluto conjunction. Late 80s, early 90s, Neptune-Pluto. Uranus-Pluto, Neptune-Pluto. Then 2012 to 2015, but using Tarnassian orbs, 2010 to 2020 is the Uranus-Pluto square. And in the Uranus-Pluto square, you have all the issues that were around in the 60s, sex, drugs, rock and roll, legalization of marijuana, feminism now, transgender, gender fluidity, gay marriage. I mean, you had civil rights of the 60s, the Uranus-Pluto, civil rights. And now you had Ferguson and George Floyd, and those are just points, but you had civil rights. You had students on the street and people on the streets than you did in the 60s. And in the during the Uranus-Pluto square, you had, the Arab Spring and a revolt in Tunisia, and you had Occupy Wall Street, and for that matter, you even had Occupy Madison, Wisconsin. I mean, give me a break. It was the same energy.
Yeah.
Environmental stuff. I mean, it was just all that stuff was back. But we are now in a phase where we're getting the last flurries of that, and by next year and then in the few years that will follow, Uranus and Pluto will settle into their first comfortable position that we have experienced since the 60s, and that is the Uranus-Pluto trine. When Uranus moves into Gemini, which it tips into Gemini next year, Pluto is already tipping back and forth into Aquarius, and from 2006, 7, and 8, we have like 5 occurrences of an exact or perfected Uranus trine Pluto, while Neptune and Saturn are at the midpoint moving into Aries, and while Jupiter is kind of moving around to Leo. And this is extraordinary. And I don't, this is not meant to be a predictive night, but everything that's going on right now is feeding into that.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at, really, was what you just said. So we're going to have Neptune and Saturn moving into Aries together. We're going to have Saturn squaring Jupiter during this time. And those aren't like very, those are more, they happen more frequently. But you were talking about like the late 60s, and then you thought like the world was ending or whatever, or
Well,
like
I didn't
things were
think
gonna
it was.
change.
It was.
It was.
It still is.
But then it didn't. And so, but it's changed. Like you go through the 80s, you go through the 90s, the early aughts, and now we're at another time where we're feeling that shift. We're feeling the tension. We're at the Pluto return in the United States. So when
when did the Pluto return happen? So here's I geek out on things like this. When all the astrologers in 2022 was talking about Pluto reaching the end of Capricorn, the U.S. or the Declaration of Independence chart, July 4th, has basically Pluto at, 28 degrees of Capricorn.
Yeah.
And when Pluto came around again, that was it. And I said, something's weird here. Because according to the NASA database, it takes Pluto 248 years to make one complete cycle. And 1776 plus 248 is 2024, not 2022. And it took me a while to untangle this. And of course, I get on the phone and I call Gary Kristen and I call Brett Joseph, Gemini Brett, and whatever. Okay, I need some help here to understand this. And I realized right away that what it was because of the precession of the equinox. 1 degree every 72 years, 250 years, you've slipped, 3 degrees back or 2.5 degrees back. And so when everyone is saying Pluto has returned to where it was, tropically it has, but it hadn't completed an orbit. It was at 357 degrees of a 360-degree cycle, and it got me into a death spiral about, using precessed Saturn returns and solar returns and so on. And it's like, the system is not as exact. The nature doesn't care about our mechanical bullshit. It's like, and astrology suffers from a couple of things: astrology and astrologers. One is the illusion that we can reduce it to a mechanical, craft of Cartesian mathematics and know everything. And then the other thing is that astrology has all the answers. Astrologers suffer from the same thing that we blame or that we say fundamental adherents of fundamental religions, fundamental Christianity or Islam or whatever religion. Medical doctors, people in the medical profession, and for that matter, most scientists. We suffer from the same thing that they suffer from. And it's the belief that we think we know, it's the belief that we think we know.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And we don't. We have a cool mapping system. I mean, it's cool enough that it's basically kept my attention for 50 years. And I feel like there's more that I want to know than I've ever known before that I don't know, And so it's not like I'm dissing astrology. It just doesn't give it's not an answer. It's just basically a mapping tool. It's a great mapping tool, but it's a mapping tool.
Okay, so to answer the original question,
Thank you.
to give us an answer before we go to the break. So Saturn and Neptune will meet up in Aries. Jupiter will move into Cancer to square it, right? Eventually, like in a year or
Right,
so.
but more importantly, it's then going to move into Leo, and it's
Yes.
going to sextile and trine everything. And if anyone has not looked at the chart for, I think a good chart to look at is July 24th, 2026. I've gone back about 1,000 years. There's nothing. I've never seen a chart where Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Jupiter are all mutually trined and sextiled, and of course opposed to get to the Jupiter in Leo opposed Pluto in Aquarius.
So-
Never seen a chart like that.
So whether it's that, which, there can be too much of a good thing, right? And we can sit on our what is it, laurels or whatever.
Well, I don't
and
think
just-
it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think what it is stabilization.
Okay.
And stabilization sounds like a good thing unless it stabilizes in a way that you don't want it to stabilize in. But I think that right now we're at the height of the last wave of potential make it change. Because by the time we get to 2026, 7, and 8, we're not going to, whatever it is, in every issue that's bifurcated as crazy extremes as things are, whatever those issues are, that one's going to be there. This one's going to be there, not here. And no one's going to be happy because no one's going to get all of what their divisions are, whether it's, a right to life versus medical autonomy and vaccines, or whether it's government, no government, or colonialism, or, whatever the issues. There are 100 issues. Every one of them is bifurcated now. And my belief, based upon what I know, is that we're not going to have as much fluidity or the ability to make changes on any of those by the time we get to this crazy, like almost like an alloy. I've been using the image, copper, malleable, beautiful, but not good for much that's useful in the productive world because it bends too easily. Tin bends easily, but it's brittle, but it's also, it's useful if you bend it slowly, but it breaks. You melt tin and copper, and then when it cools, it's bronze.
So
and that holds its shape, and you can't just remelt it into something else. And I think what we're coming from copper and tin that's going to mold into bronze by 2026, 7, 8. That's my belief.
So the copper's Venus, right? And the tin is Saturn.
No, tin is Jupiter.
Tin is Jupiter.
In fact, copper, Venus is copper. Where was Venus born? Cyprus. The sperm of Saturn washed onto the waves onto the shores of Cyprus. Cyprus is Latin for copper. Where did the Romans get their copper? Cyprus. Okay, where did they get their tin? Because they had to make bronze. There was no tin locally. This is so weird. What does Jupiter rule? Things that are far away. The reason why Rome built roads all through Europe, and in particular to England, is they had to go to England to get the tin. It's crazy. I can't make this shit up this good, Because tin and Jupiter and Venus, the benefics, when they combine, they make something that's really, really cool, bronze.
Yeah.
But I think that's what we're heading to. I think we're heading to bronze, so metaphorically speaking.
Yeah, I love. Well, there we go.
Yeah.
I remember you bringing that chart up last weekend, and that was really interesting. So I think it's a good one to look into. Definitely. Well, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to come back to a few more questions. Please help yourself to drinks and snacks while we're on our break. Good. Okay. All right. Welcome back, everyone. So we're just going to pick up where we left off. But Rick, I was wondering, so Aaron Sullivan once wrote in Dynasty, the astrology of family dynamics, today's planetary configuration is tomorrow's leading generation. So we kind of talked about that previously, but how do you feel about that, and where do you think we are with it today?
Well, I think it's very significant that patterns which we look at as transits in the moment are people that are being born in the moment. So there's a whole generation of people who, in the 1960s, when we look at these slow-moving aspects, do people know what the lag of seasons is? You ever learn that in school? Mm-hmm. It's why December 21st is not the coldest day of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, even though there's less light and less sun, because the waters on Earth have absorbed heat, and it takes a while for material reality to catch up with what's happening in the sky. And so often the hottest day of summer is not until, maybe August. Whereas the most light on the planet, on the Northern Hemisphere, is on June 21st. Stop yelling, Rick. Well, the same is true when it comes to these slow-moving outer planets. If you have it in your chart, it's yours. It's an aspect. But often it takes time for things to catch up. So when you look at, for example, the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of 1964-5, mm-hmm. 3 times in that period of time, there were events that were significant, but they weren't obvious as to what was going to happen until 3, 5, 8 years later. I mean, the Berkeley free speech movement in 64 kind of set in tone what were student demonstrations in 67, 68, Kent State, 69, 70, 71, and yet in 1964 and 65 was when IBM came out with the IBM 360, which was like it changed everything in the realm of information dispersion. Incidentally, just like the Gutenberg printing press at the conjunction of Uranus and Pluto in 1455, you see these repeating events. So people born in 1964, 65, for that matter, if you look at a natal chart, you would see a Uranus-Pluto conjunction, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67 even, still just a couple of degrees orb. And those people have that point in their chart so that when, for example, there's Uranus moving through, they had that in Virgo in the mid-60s, so therefore, when Uranus or Saturn and Neptune all moved through Sagittarius, in the mid-'80s and into the late '80s and early '90s, they're all getting that as a square. So you get these generational moments of becoming that are based upon signatures that we experience as something coming through us. For example, again, anyone born, in 2020-ish, is born with a Saturn and Pluto and, Jupiter and the South Node in Capricorn. So what's going to happen with those people, when there's planets moving through Aries, like Saturn, squaring that, they'll still be young, but when Saturn, moving through Aries is forming the square to those planets, or Neptune moving through Aries. And so, that makes sense to me. By the way, Erin, who, as most of you who knew Erin's work, a very brilliant astrologer, and someone who sometimes had a little bit of trouble on the Earth plane. And someone in the back, I don't remember who was, mentioned, Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, the book by Tom Wolfe. And Erin was right in the middle of that culture. Smack in the middle. She was in charge of the first aid tent at Woodstock. But whenever I see Erin, or whenever I used to see Erin, because I have done a lot with the harmonic aspects like quintiles and septiles and so on, Erin had one of the most heavily septiled charts that I've ever seen. And septiles are often otherworldly, and they're not here, they're complicated. And every time I saw her, it would be, "Hey, Erin," and she'd go, "Hey, Rick, how are my reptiles?"
So I like the analogy that you started out with. Did you call it the lag in seasons?
In earth science and in meteorology, it's called the lag of seasons.
Lag of seasons.
It takes a while for things to catch up to what is happening. And even with personal transits, often the lag is less long. I think there's a word for that, shorter. But even still, sometimes the real result of a transit does. I always keep feeling like there's all these people over here, and then my back's to you.
It's okay.
That's okay.
But sometimes sometimes a transit occurs, and it's not until days or weeks later. Yeah. And it's really interesting because often you see someone and with a lot of cardinal in their chart, or Gemini and cardinal, and often a transit occurs, and they'll get the reaction to it before it occurs. But then you look at someone with a fixed chart, and sometimes it takes days or weeks or even months for the lag of seasons to kind of, hit them over the head.
Mm-hmm. So looking at that from a generational perspective, the analogy brings my brain to climate change. Like it's analogous to climate change, right? Because climate change would be the accumulation of the lag in seasons over time, and life in reality, the way that transits and natal placements actually manifest, you would look at that as, okay, you have a chart, you are from a generation, but then
that's what they say.
Lisa has a chart and she's from a generation, but you experience that as a transit, but you have your own lag in seasons in your chart and she has her own, and we all do. So it's like this accumulation over time, so nothing's happening to any one generation in a vacuum. It's happening all at the same time, right? Just reading the ephemeris, right? Like the accumulation of all of these things. So I guess what I'm saying, I'm not really sure, is just we have these generations, and Erin said, what did she say? today's configurations are
Today's
tomorrow's.
transits are tomorrow's people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically.
And not to like just go back to what I was saying before, but like how do we use it?
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering. So when I think about this, I'm thinking about astrologers. So
Yeah.
we were talking. Who weren't you showing me the Gen Z Bible?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so I'm just thinking about.
Gen Z rewrote the Holy Bible in Gen Z language, which is very Jupiter and Gemini.
When you say Gen Z, are you talking about a human generation or
Yeah.
Jennifer's art? Because I have a few. No, because
Not the new president.
because Jen,
So funny.
because Jen Zard is the only person I know who has an entire damn generation named after her.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
That's
I mean,
pretty
Because
amazing.
everyone who knows her well calls her Gen Z.
that's yeah.
That's her name.
Yes, and she's pretty incredible. But Generation Z, like Pluto and Sag.
Thank you.
Yeah, they have rewritten or have started to rewrite the Holy Bible in their own language, which I think is Jupiter and Gemini, just manifesting a little bit early. But
Well, I hate to break it to them, but they're not the first people who have rewritten the Bible.
no, they're not. Nope.
But you know,
And I love. I think Susie and I were talking about this earlier when I was here last weekend. That Rob Hand once did maybe it was up in Sedona. It's all blur for me right now. But Rob Hand once did a lecture on fundamentalism, where he defined fundamentalism as a misinterpretation of a bad translation of an allegedly and divinely inspired piece of writing. I'll say that again. It's a misinterpretation of a bad translation of an allegedly divinely inspired piece of writing. The Bible has been translated so many times and so many times that what we read in the Bible really has very little to do with what the intent of what it was in Aramaic, which probably is not based on reality anyhow, because it was 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 generations from when the time that all the events went down.
So Frank
What's
had
that?
yeah, that's
So Frank
That's what
had a
I'm
great
getting to.
question.
You can't say
Yeah.
amen when someone's dissing religion. That doesn't work.
all right. Well, we were talking about language.
Yes.
And that's the whole reason I brought up the Bible, because you were reading me this new translation and some of the words like sus. I mean, I have no idea
Yeah.
what that means, but
We had to look up a lot of the things to understand what it meant.
sure. Yeah. So I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about what Aaron said, and I'm thinking about astrology and how you can read some old texts. And, you know, a lot of it was written in kind of harsh ways. And so now we have astrologers who have different perspectives, and perhaps we're more evolved or elevated. So how do you think what Aaron says relates to the way that we translate charts now and actually talk to clients and talk to people about what's happening in their chart? Because you definitely, well, most likely wouldn't say something that was written out of a book in 1940, right?
Well, not unless you looked at a chart and said that your Mars is afflicted, you know, or whatever. I mean, the languaging was very different. But it's not just the new vocabulary. It's astrology is always culturocentric. I made that up. I don't think there's a real word. And that as culture changes, so does astrology. And although I think that what we learned, I mean, again, talking about the recent history of astrology, another piece of this, there's lots of pieces that we haven't talked about and that we may not talk about them all. But again, prior to the internet, you know, to the mass flourishing of the internet, the first crowdsourcing project that absolutely totally changed the face of modern astrology was Arhat, which then became Project Hindsight. And Arhat was a little organization, a nonprofit that Rob Hand created called, see if I can do this, Arhat, the Association for the Retrieval of Historical Astrological Texts, Arhat. And that then became, when he kind of got together and talked about this idea with Robert Zoller and Rob Schmidt, the three of them created an organization called Project Hindsight. And Rob basically unveiled that at a NORWAC in which he basically came up with the idea, or the group came up with the idea, that they wanted to translate old material that had never really been translated correctly. I mean, even books like by Ptolemy, which we had translated, they were translated mostly by academicians who were translating Ptolemy, who had no interest and no belief, and in fact were sure that astrology was just some ancient superstition, so they didn't try to make any of it make any sense. And so they went back and they basically funded the translating of historical astrological texts through a crowdsourcing where you paid, I think it was $10 a month, and every month you got a little booklet of what was translated in the previous month in the mail. I have cartons full of these little pamphlets that I can't pretend that I've read them all, but I have them, you know, as probably many other people do who were at that time involved. But what came through from that period of time in the 90s were translations, you know, of all of the, from Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and Sanskrit. Those are the main languages that were translated, and volumes of material that had never seen the light of the 20th century. And remember, translations are really important. I mean, here's a little known piece of history that may be my, okay, guy walks into a restaurant and the sign says breakfast served at any time. And he said, okay, I'll have French toast during the Renaissance. Stephen Wright line, not mine. What's that? Got it? Okay. Anyhow, the court astrologer to 3 generations of Medicis, Marsilio Ficino. People know Marsilio Ficino. I think I talked a little bit about him on Friday night. But Marsilio Ficino was funded by the Medicis, and his first job was to translate this Greek text that was smuggled out of Constantinople after the fall of Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, to the east. And what he translated was this Greek material written by this guy named Plato. And he translated it from Greek into Latin. And it just so happened that that was in the 1470s and early 1480s. And that was translated in Florence at the time when the first German printing presses, remember, at the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in 1455, the first printing presses in Italy were in Venice. So that Marsilio Ficino's translations of Plato and his translations of what we now call the Corpus Hermetica hit the printing press. And again, the lag of seasons, that was in the 1480s, 1490s, took 100 years, but there was the Protestant Reformation. And so translations are incredible by what they unleash. And the translations of the Greek and Arabic, the Greek and Arabic/Persian, and the Latin scholars in astrology was just amazing. And we now have people like Demetra George and Chris Brennan, and obviously Rob Hand, who was kind of one of the ringleaders on that. And incidentally, I did an interview for the Mountain Astrologer. I think it was 1994. I think it was 1994. And in it, I said that Project Hindsight was like our secret initiate order, and that in order to be a priest, that the priests were, instead of like, you know, Catholic ministers are called priests, and Zoroastrian ministers are called magi, that in the astrology, the priests, there was the order of the Robbites, because it was Rob Hand, Rob Zoller, and Robert Schmidt were the 3. And so they were known as the Robbites. And then somewhere along the line, Dennis Harness and Dennis Flaherty, who were the 2 organizational leaders kind of in Vedic astrology, they countered and said, we're starting an organization called the Denites. So what was the question?
You answered it, but I was just wondering about language and, how you feel astrologers can speak to clients today.
Well, okay, so languaging is really, really significant. And I'm doing a talk on this at NORWAC next weekend.
Cool.
Next weekend.
2 weeks.
Huh?
Is it 2 weeks?
No.
I think it's next.
Oh, is
Next
it
Friday.
week?
Yeah.
Oh, it's not
Memorial
the 31st?
Day.
Oh, okay.
No.
I'm not going, so I don't know.
No.
Okay.
No, you're not allowed to go
Okay,
this
yeah.
year. Okay, but I'm doing a talk on I think it might be called gender bias in astrology or something like that. But the problem is, and I say this, I don't say it enough, and I say it way too much, that astrology was written by guys and for guys. Period. And there's simple languaging that I make a concerted effort to change in my own vocabulary, and certainly in my students and in my apprentice program, we work on changing it, but it's so easy to slip back into. One of the words that I've tried to eliminate is the word ruler. Planets don't rule signs. That's a result of a hierarchical, colonialistic, patriarchal thinking. There's no dominance of the rulers. They're associated. Yeah, I see. Yeah, so I see Susie, for those of you who are watching this, Susie Cox is going like this. It's not this way, it's an association. But we see this a lot. There's languaging that we don't even think about. Buckminster Fuller used to say, we'll never understand the world we live in if we keep talking about the sunrise and the sunset. Sun doesn't rise. That's old thinking based upon a geocentric view of the world. In the morning, we have a sunset, and in the evening, we have a sun eclipse. So there's lots of language that becomes really important, and some of it has to do with association. Some of it has to do with how we interpret a chart. Again, I talked a little bit about this last weekend here, but the idea that when we look at a chart, we're basically mapping 10 points on a spherical mapping system. We have the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 20 or 50 other things. Rob Hand calls that space gravel. But we're making a chart based upon lumps in space. The problem with that, and this is something that is occurring whether we're realizing it or not, and we are changing our language gradually whether we realize it or not, but I'm a proponent of changing our language consciously so that because we can understand why this is happening. And if I sat in a room 100 years ago, I was really young then, and I said, so why do you guys do charts? Everyone would have the same answer. Well, we do charts to make predictions. If I asked you that question today, why do you do a natal chart? I would guess that 80% of you, maybe more, wouldn't say to make predictions. You would say to help a client, to help people understand where they are, to give people empowered choices, to help my clients or people's charts I'm doing to co-create their future. I mean, you would voice it in a number of different ways. But this is an invisible shift that astrology made in the 20th century. But again, it's taking a generation or 2 or 3 for it to play on through. And the reason why we're dealing with this is because of quantum physics. And it's the quantum physicists understood, or they were confronted with the problem that when they began to look at things that were very small, not in the material, 3-dimensional physical world that we know it, that things weren't things. Particles weren't particles. They were vibrations. Oh, that's what Pythagoras said. The universe consists of vibrations. And he said no vibration arises on its own. All vibrations arise in sympathetic mutual harmony. Oh, that's the music of the spheres, huh?
In the beginning was the word. And
Bad translation. It wasn't the word.
What was it?
Logos.
There you go.
And what is logos? It's not a word. In the beginning, there was logos. And we think of the word logos as the root of like a word like astrology, astrologos. It's the logical rationalization, the logic part of astrology, of astro, stars. But logos, actually, in Aramaic and in Greek, the word logos meant the speaking of a vibration that already existed metaphysically that brought it into form.
Yeah.
That's very different than the word.
But it's that vibration.
Oh,
that you're
yeah, no,
talking
it's ultimately the same thing, but again,
Yeah.
it gets back to language.
Yeah.
So this thing about changing languaging is that once we understand that the universe consists of what physicists call the particle-wave duality. Light travels like a wave, no question about it. We can show it, we can demonstrate it. It's provable. Light travels like a wave. And yet Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize because he proved that light is a particle, a packet of energy we call a photon. So the particle-wave duality is that light travels like a wave, but when you look at it, it's a particle. How does that happen? Well, the moon, which was about half full last night, I'm pointing, I don't know what the hell, which way I'm facing, but the moon is about half full. You look up at the moon, and then you put it in a chart in whatever constellation or whatever mapping system you use, then you map the sun and Mars and all these different particles, and they are particles. But the moon is also a 13-cycle-a-year wave. When you're not looking at it, just like when you're not looking at a packet of light, it's waving along, you know? And so does the moon. And so does Saturn, makes 3 waves or three cycles, a little bit over that, of a century. Pluto makes 4 cycles every 1,000 years. It's a wave of 4 cycles a millennium. But when we look at it, it's a particle in Aquarius. I call them BFPs, and I know I said this the other night or last week. I call the planets BFPs. They're big fucking particles. But they're still particles when we look at them. But here's the thing, is that when we're not looking at them, they're traveling like waves. And our languaging has begun to become more wave-like, whether we know it or not, because particle is to wave, catch this, like fate is to free will. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle said that at any given moment, the more you know about where a subatomic thing is, the less you know about where it's going. The more you know about the waveness of an electron, the less you know where it is. You can't know where it is and where it's going at the same time. And when we pop that quantum wave function and map 10 particles in a chart, we're looking at fate, because fate is particle. And yet the quantum field, the indeterminate field of waves is still humming out there. And when I teach chart interpretation, I'm teaching, forget about what this square, that means. Well, don't forget about it. Put it in the back of your head. We want to look at the chart, and we don't want to make individual points of determination. What's the hum of the chart? Because we're all dancing to the music of the spheres. It's just so low frequency, we can't hear it with our ears, but we're dancing to it.
Yeah.
And so this is the change of language that we're seeing through the rise, the merging of theosophy and depth psychology through the works of Jung and James Hillman and Jungians, Rick Tarnas, and so on, and through theosophy, Dane Rudhyar, and the humanists, the merging of those and the infusion in the 1960s of the Asian way of thinking, of whether you practice Jyotish or Vedic astrology or not, that the idea that this 3-dimensional world of particles is not real. What's real, that's Maya in the Hindu way of looking at it. What's real is the world behind it. The veil of illusion is what we perceive. The same thing is when we look at a chart. We're seeing the particles, and we are gradually focusing on understanding the waves, which is why we see a rise in vibrational astrology and cosmobiology, 90-degree wheels, fourth harmonic charts and so on. That's all part of this shift from particle to wave that we as a culture are in because of the technological changes. What was the question?
It seems
So, go ahead.
One thing, real quick thing. I have to apologize, not just for being late, but I have Mercury at 9 Aries, Mars at 12, and Venus at 13. And the Sun at 16. Does anyone know where Mars is in the sky right now, today?
Returning.
Where?
14.
13. It's conjunct. It's conjuncting my. This week, Mars is conjuncting my Mercury, my Mars, and my Venus. So if I'm a little over-amping, I don't apologize for it. I get to blame it as an astrologer on the sky.
With the North Node, of course.
Yeah, that's still down the road a little.
No, but I really appreciate everything that you said, because like what I heard and where my brain went was, there are waves and there are undulations in what is said, what is done, what is had, what is experienced, what is assumed, and what is known and what is not known.
That was a great list.
Thanks.
Yeah,
We'll catch
really
that.
good
I
list.
think we got it recorded, so.
Yeah, no, good.
Back to it. Right?
And those waves occur in a slower frequency. You see, we know of a wave by its periodicity. We know, like when we hear music, you hear a note, A above middle C, what we're hearing is 440 beats a second against our ear, and we can hear that. But if it's lower than 40 or 50 beats a second and higher than, 20 or 30 or 40,000, depending upon your age and your hearing, you don't hear it. And yet planets are not beating at cycles per second. They're beating at cycles per year, or cycles per century, or cycles per millennium. But there's still waves, we're riding those waves, but we're only riding like on a Pluto wave. We're lucky if Pluto happens to be moving fast, like it does from Leo to Aquarius, and we get it in 70, 80 years. But if we're born with Pluto in Aquarius, it's going to take almost 170 years for Pluto to go around the other half of the circle.
Yeah. And I am not a mathematician. Like, I was until 7th grade, and then I was like, peace out, y'all. But I feel like there is this exponential compounding of the pace of evolution and technology that's happening.
No question about it.
Right?
Yeah.
So with that said, what is the future of astrology? And, our world is moving faster. So what's the future of organizations, of astrology, of even clients who have expectations on what a reading should be, right? And how, astrologers give them readings. Not that, every astrologer is different.
And how do we help ourselves?
Yeah,
Say
how
again?
How do we help ourselves? Like, how do we help ourselves towards a good outcome, or like helping humanity?
What's that? Good answer. Well, it is a good question, and I think that's different for each person.
Yeah.
But I think there are some things. For those of you who listen to me online, I end almost every broadcast with my version of think globally, act locally, and that's think cosmically, act locally. Because the gift that we have as astrologers, whatever type of astrology we happen to be practicing, the gift that we have is to make things that were previously invisible and out of our awareness into our awareness, or make it visible. I mean, everyone goes through a Saturn return, whether they know it or not. And if you know it and you're aware of it, then you can be reminded that this is where I am, and therefore feel like you're part of a flow. One of the questions that I've asked over the years, and I've had this discussion with a number of astrologers, and it's a metaphor for something else. The question is, if you're a caterpillar that is now in a cocoon, and your skin has begun to disintegrate, and your eyeballs are melting, and you're basically, everything in your caterpillarness is kind of disintegrating. Is there a way to get a message into the caterpillar while it's in that process? It's okay, dude. You gotta, you thought you were a caterpillar, but you're really a butterfly, and don't panic, don't freak out. Just let it unfold in time, and you're right on course. This is something that you're riding a 2 billion year wave of evolution, and it's no problem. Just go with it right now. Is there a way to get that message into the cocoon? And I would suggest that anyone going through a Pluto transit is that caterpillar in the cocoon.
Amen.
And it's the wrong time to try to tell the person what's going on because they're in meltdown. Now, there is a book that addresses that, and it's a surprising book unless you've heard me talk about this before, and that is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. In Tibetan, it's Bardo Thodol. And Bardo Thodol, like many Tibetan words, it takes a paragraph to say what one word means in our language. But Bardo is a state of non-physical existence, sometimes referred to the in-between states. It's the disincarnates. I did a lecture a number of years ago in several different settings called Consciousness Con Carne. That's my lecture on reincarnation. Because in the Bardo states, your consciousness incarnate. Consciousness does fine without physicality, without being trapped in a meat suit, meat body, whatever. So, is it for me? And so the thing about what the Thodol part of Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan, what's called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is actually enlightenment in the in-between states through recognition by hearing. Now, key words there are recognition, because you can't recognize something unless you've already cognized it. And this is what a pattern is. This is why astrology is outside of the realm of science, because science is built upon the concept of repeatability and pattern recognition. And so you develop these instruments, and you can make an instrument that's tuned to 103.7 million cycles a second. And when you tune that, you immediately receive frequencies that are being broadcast by an FM radio station at 102.7 megacycles or a million cycles a second. But science can't instrument a cycle like Saturn that is 3 cycles a century, because the way they do that is they make a beat and then they wait for the next one. Well, okay, let's wait 29 and a half years. Oh, got it, boom. Now let's see if it's an arbitrary thing or if it's repetitive. We got to wait another 30 years. And so the cycles in astrology are lower or infra to the, it's like we don't see infrared, we feel it as heat. But because we can only see in certain spectrums of reality. As I like to say, there's no such thing as the color green out there, or the color red, which is, of course, the name of the state of color red, Colorado. But there is no red out there. What there is 723, I made that number up, but it's close, 723 trillion cycles every second. When that impinges upon our eyes, we register it as red. But bees don't see red; they see ultraviolet, higher frequency waves that we can't even see. So the planets are just particle waves.
So basically, if we could go 50 years into the future and look back and tell ourselves something today, we probably couldn't tell ourselves because we're not ready to hear it yet.
Oh, well, I'll tell you what 50 years in the future, astrologers sitting in this room, if they are, will say, can you believe that they were doing charts on flat pieces of paper, flat screens? God, that's almost as dumb as them doing them on squares like, they did back in that day. We look at back, and say, there were a time when they only used 7 planets and they did it on squares, and yet we do a 3-dimensional chart with everything moving at different rates and different speeds that speed up and slow down and interact and harmonize with each other, and we somehow flatten it to a piece of paper, which is why we have 20 some odd different house cusp systems, because when you take a sphere and you flatten it, something has to get bent out of shape. Don't ever talk to me about the importance of a transit to a 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, 8th, 9th, or 11th, 12th house, because I'll just laugh at you. I'll say, what house cusp system are you using? Oh, I use Placidus. Well, what about Marinus, Campanus, Coke, Regiomontanus, Equal House, so on? because all these different systems are used by some people, and they don't change the ascendant and the midheaven, or the AC and the ascendant and descendant, or the MC, the medium celli, and the imium celli, the top and the bottom of the heavens. Those don't change. But all the intermediate house cusps do. They're all made up. We think we know more than we do, just like a medical doctor.
So what do you think people will be doing in 50 years? How will we be interpreting?
Oh, I think that they'll have three-dimensional models and maybe even holographic models that you can either be in the center of or walk around and get the hum of a chart, and you'll be able to tune it. And I mean, this technology is all there, and I know some people who are playing with augmented reality, virtual reality, whatever you want to call it, where you can actually walk through your own planets in your chart, and that'll basically be part of the modeling. Undoubtedly, where we go with that, I don't know, but that I think is there. I think also 5 or 10 years, some group of graduate students at MIT or Stanford are going to announce the discovery of low-frequency gravitational waves that impact how we live and what we do. And we've now measured them, and it's amazing because we now understand time in a way we never did. But this has nothing to do with astrology.
To kind of bring us back to the beginning, when you talked about Pythagoras, two women in New Orleans, I believe, just found 11 new ways to prove the Pythagorean theorem. So I feel like going back to the beginning, we can then move forward again in new ways with new words, new language, new proofs, and things like that. Did you want to talk about what was fun and what was hard?
Yeah, we can. So
Wait, just before, the thing about temporal positioning systems, we'll have apps on our cell phone that we'll be able to tell our cell phone, I met this guy yesterday, I really want to give him a call, and the cell phone will say, wait 3 hours. No astrology. It'll just, the cell phone will already know my birth data,
And you're
I have a job application, or I want to buy a house. Is it, well, if you wait a month or two, you'll be a lot better off. That's temporal positioning systems, but it may or may not be related to astrology in language, but it'll be astrology. And I think I know people already now who are very, I want to say high up, but it's not. They're very acknowledged in the world of AI and AI development, and and creating AI characters.
persona or
personas,
chatbot,
and two of them that I know are incredibly good astrologers working on real AI astrology.
I mean, it makes sense. It's just algorithms, and so you can get algorithms based on people's actions and their behaviors, and take that over time, and then you could correlate that to astrology.
Well, and to say that they're just algorithms, then in some level, so are we. But the mechanistic piece is not the same as the organic piece. And anyone who's a sci-fi buzz nut addict knows that one of the continuing themes in modern science fiction is the intergalactic, never-ending battle between the orgs and the mechs. And that's not Mexicans, and it's the organics and the mechanicals. These are the two life forms in the universe that have always existed side by side and strive for dominance one over the other.
Terminator 2.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So 3 last questions. We can just kind of intertwine them. So what was fun for you? What was hard for you? Or what is, it doesn't have to be was. And what advice would you give to the astrological community or astrologers today? Nothing.
Well, it's like whatever I say in answer to those questions today will be completely different than what I would say in an hour or tomorrow, because I'm just making it up. I don't know, but I think what was hard for me, I think was, as a guy with 4 planets closely conjunct in Aries and a Cancer moon, I don't think I was into my 20s before I really even realized I had a Cancer moon. You know, and so what was hard for me, you know, in this culture was the working out of that partile square between my sun and moon, and that is, I think, then therefore working out the relationship between objective and subjective reality, between science and art. They're both loud. You know, my sun is, you know, exalted in Aries conjunct Mars in its domicile. Notice how I didn't say ruler. And that moon in Cancer in its domicile. And so for what's been hard for me is trying to create a path with a Gemini rising that somehow didn't overpower one of those things with the other. I mean, I went through certainly much of my childhood, you know, hunting and fishing and reading books and doing math and being, you know, like a right-handed, left-brain geek, you know. And at some point in time, and of course, I was blessed because I also had music and music training very solid in my life, and it was important. But then I went through a time where all that went away, and I just, you know, wanted to, you know, smoke dope and listen to music. But you know, I mean, but it was the other side of the brain, in effect. And so I think that it's difficult for many of us to balance the subjective, objective, the right brain, the left brain, the masculine, the feminine, you know, the having to work in the real world and survive and pay rent, and then yet create and do and be what we want to be. And so that's a kind of an easy one, and you don't want to hear any of the specific instances of those crises of which I dealt with that issue. But you know, that's I think the overriding thing. What's fun? If it's fun, it's fun. I don't know. What's fun? Probably the same thing that's fun for you guys. Discovery is fun. You know, thinking about something and doing it in a way that you kind of think, whether it's true or not, that Johannes Kepler, when he recalculated the orbit of Mars after Tycho Brahe died and left him all of his data, Johannes Kepler kind of came up with the laws of planetary motion. Excuse me again. And we kind of came up, he figured out the last missing puzzle, and Mars was the most problematic of all the planets based upon the geocentric to the heliocentric model. Then he had all of this data, and when he recalculated it with his new data, he realized that Ptolemy's calculations were off 8 minutes of arc a year. And this was kind of and he said, I have touched mountains, and it is tremendous what they belch forth. I've robbed the ancient sacred crypts of Egypt. He basically discovered something that no human had ever discovered. And I feel blessed that I kind of stumbled onto a few things that, you know, I'm an Aries. And again, whether I'm first and whether anyone knows that I got it for, I don't give a shit. But that's what's fun, is staying up until 4 a.m, either on a computer with Excel or with looking at charts or doing I'll tell you something I discovered a few weeks ago. And I think it's really important. And I don't know of any other astrologer who has, quote unquote, realized this. So April 20th, we had a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, right? All right. Keywords Jupiter. Come on. Expansion, good enough. Yeah, abundance. Good enough. Keyword Uranus.
Breakthrough.
Okay, good enough. So every 14 years, Jupiter and Uranus align, right? In modern astrology, Uranus is associated with what sign? Aquarius. All right. So everyone's been talking about how this move of Pluto into Aquarius is such a big deal thing. And it is. It is. The Jupiter-Uranus conjunction on April 20th was the first time that there was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction with Pluto in Uranus's sign, if you want to call it that, since 1789. Because we know that, you know, that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were part of the Pluto in Aquarius. I mean, that's something that's in common thought. But what's not in common thought is the fact that in June of 1789, there was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. Don't ask me what sign it's in, I can't remember. Although you could hit a computer and know almost instantaneously, which couldn't have been done before the 1970s or so. So the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which opens a portal by expanding, that's what Jupiter does, by magnifying, by amplifying the revolutionary breakthrough, radical energy that releases or relieves the tension that has not been able to break through the restriction of Saturn. I mean, that's Uranus's job, is to basically, blast through the hard edges of the crystallization of Saturn. Every planet has a job description. When in 1789, within a few weeks of the exact Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, was the storming of the Bastille, which was the first time that a bunch of humans got together and had the audacity and the follow-through to basically bring down a God-given right of a monarch, of a family that had the divine right in their bloodline to own a country. We don't think of it that way. We think, how cool, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, it was a big deal. It was a collective, change of, states that were not owned by a family. So, and by the way, in 1789, not only was that conjunction very close, just a few weeks away from the turning point in the French Revolution, but it was also in 1789, that was the first session of the United States Congress. That was when the U.S. Constitution was ratified. That was when the American judicial system was set up the way it is today, 250 years later. And so now we have the first Jupiter-Uranus conjunction with Pluto in Aquarius since 1789. And what's happening at Jupiter, institutions of higher learning, Jupiter, faraway things, the revolution that's occurring on college campuses largely, it's occurring in more places than that, but it's up against a power structure that's like and as powerful and as daunting as the monarchy was 250 years ago. It's impossible to bring it down. Huh? That's the point. It's coming down. And it may not be pleasant, because when someone, and neither was the French Revolution, neither was the American Revolution, and when it happened, there was MAGA people at that time in the United States who were absolutely against this horrific blasting into the future. They wanted the safety of the status quo. And I'm not taking political, I'm not trying to instigate whatever, any sort of political thing here. I'm just simply saying that there's bigger things going on that have to do with why the copper and tin are so dynamic right now, that what we're seeing on college campuses is not going to go away tomorrow or next week or next month. And there's no easy solution to this, just like there was no easy solution to being an American, or to being born in the colonies in the 1760s and still being slave to the monarchy, or being in France or in any other monarchy at the time. The system could not be brought down, and something big is afoot.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. You were talking about your Aries and your Cancer placements and the copper and the tin. I'm thinking, and then we said copper is Venus, tin is Jupiter, and it's like, obviously those are the benefics, but there's also something there about, Venus being more akin to the moon, of that, like the moistness and the bringing together that Venus.
You can say femininity, it won't offend me, but you could certainly say the yin-ness.
Sure.
I mean, even though Jupiter is expansive and masculine, it's gaseous, and there's still a yin-ness to the way it expands.
And the left brain, right brain thing that you were saying as well. So basically the softness, the yin, the yang, bringing it together. and how it's the best of both worlds and not this one or that one that will make it work, but really the
power structure is not going to let go easily. There's a song Jackson Browne wrote in, I think, 1970, I think he wrote it, called Before the Deluge. Does anyone know that song? And in it, it starts off, some of them were dreamers, some of them were fools, basically who wanted to save the earth, thought that they were going to be the ones to do it. And one of the verses goes, some of them were angry at the way the earth was abused by the men who learned how to forge her beauty into power. And they struggled to protect her from them, only to be confused by the magnitude of the fury in the final hour. Power won't let go easily. It ain't going to be pretty. It already isn't pretty. What's going on, we sit here in a very privileged, isolated little bubble. And it's not like that for a lot of people on the planet.
Yeah.
And, and they are facing the music, and we're not in that bubble. It's an illusion. And I'm not saying, I'm not a doomer, gloomer, but, shit's going down.
It is going down, and it's going to keep going down, because when we get into Aries, when Neptune and Saturn get into Aries, all those things that keep us docile, that keep us sedated, that keep us foggy, will be gone and burned away, and the fire will really be there, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm worried about you guys. What are you going to do for water and air conditioning?
Yeah,
No,
it's legit for climate change.
It's, and I don't know how it's going to go down. I don't consider myself, prescient on that level, but it's obviously obvious to me. And again, I'm just one person with observations. So, what were the 3 questions?
So we were talking about what's fun, and I don't know that any of that is really fun, but
The discovery.
Discovery is fun.
Yeah, the discovery.
Look, I've coined a term, and again, I know some of you have heard me. I've used this term, as often as I can get away with it. But when 2 planets are aspect and they're at the same degree, what's that called?
Partile.
Partile. What happens if you have 2 planets that are at the same degree and same minute?
Is that also partile? No.
They're fucking nailed.
That's right.
My word. All my students, they look at a chart and they go, oh, look, that Venus-Jupiter trine or square is fucking nailed. Okay. I have my natal Venus at 13 degrees Aries and 44 minutes. My natal Neptune is at 13 degrees Libra, 44 minutes. They are in opposition. And of course, there's a whole Aries pack around it, and there's other things in my chart. I don't want to bore you with my whole chart. But what's fun for me is something that when Bucky Fuller said, when I'm working on a problem and I reach a solution, if it's not beautiful, I know it's not the right solution. When I'm working on a problem and it's beautiful, I know I nailed it. And for me, what's fun in my life is beauty. When I realized that Venus was the musical beat frequency to Earth of the divine proportion of the golden mean, 365 and a quarter divided by 224 and a half was 1.62. It's beautiful, It was like, that's fun to me. But I get that same amount of fun from taking an amazing photograph or writing a poem that just is like, wow, I got something, or sipping a wine that's amazing, or having food that's beautiful, or having an experience with a person, or I'm a cis hetero male with a beautiful woman. That's fun. That Venus-Neptune opposition for me, whether it's intellectual or perceptual or artistic, that's fun.
Beautiful. I feel you. I have a pretty strong Venus placement too. So, but I wanted to ask.
You're going to give me a stiff neck here.
I know, sorry.
I keep wanting to do this because I hate it when, I want to take my chair and turn it around, but then my back's to you.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, does anyone have any questions for Rick while we're here, before we all close out? And
but does anyone have any answers? I'm
Yeah.
bored with questions.
I like to call it resonance, that things resonate, the planets resonate with a sign.
Yeah, resonance is a good word, and aspects are a form of resonance. And in fact, when we talk about resonance, one of the things that I like to point out, that any engineer knows this, and that is it takes very little energy to drive a resonant circuit. If you got something that's tuned exactly right, doesn't take much energy to tickle it, to get it humming.
Mhm.
Who? Oh, yeah. West of the Rock. Are we west of the Rockies? Yeah.
Yeah.
We're south of the Mason-Dixon line and west of the Rockies. Come in, first-time caller, west of the Rockies.
So my question is I've been with you since Mountain Astrologer in the 90s, and you've been writing, involved in astrology for a very long time. What do you think is attributed to this sort of renaissance of astrology happening right now relative to the astrology currently? And how do you relate to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to say that in the late 60s, I thought that there was an incredible renaissance of astrology. It was like just amazing how it was like happening all over. But I think right now what we're experiencing, in the late 80s and through the 90s, there was a real worry amongst the, at that time, young but older astrologers, Susie and I in that group. There was a real worry about there weren't a lot of young people at conferences. And that was really where, through the work of some of these astrologers, that there was a real movement in the community to bring younger astrologers in, to create scholarships, both for, age and, and gender and ethnic diversity. And that was when AYA, the Organization of Young Astrologers, was founded. And it was all, I don't want to say it was unnecessary, I think it was all good stuff, but it was all going to happen because the internet basically exploded. And the magic of the internet is that resonance, that if I have a resonance, whether it's, collecting triangle stamps, or whether it's novels that were written in 1917, or whatever peculiar laser-like specific thing I have, I can go online and find people that resonate with it, geographically independent of the space that I live in. It used to be, as an astrologer, the clients that you had live in the same city. You lived in a small city, those were your clients. If you lived in New York, you could be a bigger astrologer because there was more people walking by your shingle or seeing your yellow page ad. And so I think that the internet has been huge in creating communities and buzz that are non-hierarchical in some cases, like that original, the astrology, mail list, the IRC, the internet relay chat that was going on, and then online communities and groups on Facebook and MySpace and so on. And so I think that young people, look, we all know, regardless of what the media says, we know astrology works. The problem is that 500 years ago, the only people who had their charts done were people who could hire someone that could spend 2 or 3 days, to do the math that was required to create the chart. And now it takes 10, 15 seconds to look at a chart. And so from that standpoint, you have an entire generation or generations of people who are coming up and go, gee, I don't believe in this, or I don't think it makes sense. Let me look. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if that so-and-so, look at that there, and so what we're getting from that is I run into, I don't want to say every day, but regularly, people who know so much astrology, they speak the language inside out, upside down, backwards, fluently, and I don't know them. They've never been to a conference. They've never interacted with anyone else, but they've been reading their astrology and doing charts of friends, since they were 10, and now they're 30. And so we do not have the problem that we thought we might with no young people coming into astrology. And so astrology's always attracted smart people. And right now what's happened is that this is just another example of the boundaries disintegrating, and the authority does not have the control because it's like a metastasized cancer. It's like the internet took this body of knowledge of astrology and went splat, and there's no way to put it back in the box. That's my short answer.
Thanks, Rick. Any other questions? not necessarily a question, but a particular quote for you about answers. The exact quote is, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete."
And I know that quote well. And Bucky Fuller actually has hanging on the wall of the U.S. Patent Office what's considered to be the perfect patent of what we would call the geodesic or geodesic dome. And we think of the geodesic as, you know, like the astrodome or those things. To Fuller, the geodesic was very simply the shortest distance between 2 points, not a straight line. And what Bucky did his entire life is he made metaphysical or mental breakthroughs, and then he modeled. And whether it was the Dymaxion car or the Dymaxion house or things like tensegrity or the Fuller Dome, the Bucky Fuller Dome, all these things were basically models that you can't make go away by saying they don't exist. And it's not about saying that doesn't work. It's like, this works better. Make it.
I think something to think about for all of us, this is a lot of what my work is dedicated to, is it's not enough to have a problem. It's important to have solutions. It's important to have a vision. And I think right now we're in a dearth of vision of what else is possible for us, what that world looks like. And we're not thinking enough about what the next system or the next reality or new ways of being can be, instead of just perpetuating capitalism or
Colonialism, capitalism, misogyny, racism, thisism, thatism, Catholicism, any ism, I don't care. You know, yes.
Yeah, and so it's more, to me, it's a challenge or an opportunity of while we're in the disintegration of what does a new world look like.
I've been trying to rephrase. I want you to finish that sentence, but I want to interrupt you because I've been trying to change how I say the word disintegration, because it's not disintegration, it's disintegration. Subtle language. It's like, but finish your sentence that I totally cut you off. I'm sorry.
I mean, that was the
Not sorry.
thought, but part of, I think, I'm going to say we're in a big fucking wave, right? Which is the convergence of cycles, the Kali Yuga, the world's ages, the precession of the equinoxes, the age of Aquarius. In human design, there's something, the 2027 prophecy. And all of this is about the fact that basically, I don't know if it's going to happen in our lifetime, but there's a range of time where there is a disintegration of structures. And we're already seeing the disillusionment with the way things are. Now, I don't know if we have the same cojones as they did in the 70s or another time in the 1770s to kind of rubber meets the road, if that's what it takes. But I think also there's an opportunity instead, and this is the power of the internet, to actually just create something that people can opt into.
And I think what you're saying is very wise, but I think that the answer, do we have it? It depends on who the we is. If it's you and me and the people in this room, maybe, some of us, maybe not. But when you look at the people who are actually on the streets right now, abso-fucking-lutely, because they ain't got shit. They were born into a world where they see it disintegrating. They see what's ahead, and it doesn't look pretty. They have less than the generations did before them, not more, and they ain't got nothing to lose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Ain't going away, you know? But I think that there's a big difference between what's happening through the Saturn-Pluto square of the 2010s and up through what's going to culminate through the 2025, 6, 7, 8, 9, is that, speaking as someone who, you know, was coming of age in the craziness of the 60s and living that, we were out on left field by ourselves. We had no guidance. There were no older people to, you know, our parents didn't have a damn clue. I mean, they had no clue. And although someone said, and I think it's true, a lot of the people who were hippies or not hippies, they've bought into the system or whatever. But a lot of them, when push comes to shove, I think that there are I know a lot of people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who look up to guides in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. I would like to think I'm one of those. I mean, You know, on a good day I am. On a bad day I'm saying, don't do that. No. But the truth is that it's what happened in the 60s and even into the early 70s won't be lost, because those people not only who lived through it, but those people who have that signature are the guides for the people now that are coming of age and expressing it. It's a very different situation. You know, and then I look at some of the people my age. You know, I'm a little bit younger, not much younger, you know, than like Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu. And I'm just, you know, they're an embarrassment to Pluto and Leo, as, you know, many people are. But I remember reading an early book, the Ron Davison book, Astrology, which is one of my favorite books, the little book that you can find it online. But in it, he had these little tables of all these planets and signs and houses and keywords and whatever. And his thing about Pluto, through all the signs in Leo, he had the word megalomania. And as a psychology student, I knew that megalomania is basically a sign of paranoid schizophrenia, where you think that you're God. And everyone with Pluto and Leo has a bit of megalomania. You know, it's the hubris to say, you know, we are all God. But Pluto and Leo ain't all bad, but problematic like every sign. Thanks for that sharing.
Thanks, Leah. Does anyone else have any questions for Rick? No? Okay. Well,
I have a question.
You guys,
I have a question. What's the best restaurant place where we can all go and have something to eat and or drink and hang out?
Close by, I would say Sace or Augustine. It's right there.
You guys decide, but I'm in.
Cool.
Let's
vote.
I'm having a Mars return. I'm not going to say.
Rick.
Thank you. We'll go. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and I have to say this was the strangest talk that I've ever given, because I normally over-prepare and have notes and research and PowerPoints and whatever, and I said when we began talking about it, I said, can we do this like without a PowerPoint, without it, just like hang out? So thank you for that.
Well, that's the vibe. So, well, not always, but that's what we wanted the vibe to be today. So
Cool.
thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for supporting COSME, supporting astrology, and supporting your self-development through astrology. That's the most important.
And think cosmically, act locally. It's true.